All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our lecture that we're going to be presenting, which is called Creating the Border, Art, Politics, and Stories. It's going to be a lecture led by Dr. John Morán González as part of the museum's current exhibit, which is Mexico, the Border and Beyond, selections from the Juan Antonio Sandoval collection. And my name is Jose Martinez. I do education here at the museum, and I'm simply going to be moderating, facilitating, and my colleague, Dr. George Vargas, curator, director of programs, is going to be hosting the conversation with Dr. John Morales. So I'm going to give the floor to him now, and here we go.
Thank you, Jose. Bienvenidos. Welcome. My name is Dr. George Vargas, curator and director of programs at Mexico Museum in Austin, Texas. Today, we present the virtual lecture series dedicated to life and experiences in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, which examines the cultural history and social issues as portrayed by artists in the El Paso, Juarez, and the U.S.-Mexico border region. In early 2020, Mr. Juan Antonio Sandoval Jr. donated his wonderful collection of art and books to the museum. The current exhibition, Mexico, the Border and Beyond, features selections from the Juan Sandoval collection and is on view until August 22nd. A large part of the exhibition focuses on artworks on the life and experiences in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, which are divided into 5 themes. 5 scholars will individually examine a theme. Before we continue, the museum wants to thank our sponsors and especially the National Endowment for the Humanities for their generous support of this program. Also, we invite viewers to submit questions and comments to our lecturer, who will respond afterwards. Without further ado, the museum presents Creating a Border, Art, Politics, and Stories, a lecture by Dr. John Morán González, the J. Frank Dobie Regents Professor of American and English Literature and Director of the Center for Mexican-American Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Vargas. I'd like to thank you and Executive Director Silvia Orozco and all the wonderful staff at Mexico Museum for this invitation. I would also like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for sponsoring the exhibit lecture series. And I would also like to thank the generous bequest of Juan Antonio Sandoval Jr., a true resident of the El Paso, Ciudad Juarez borderlands, for his collection, amazing collection, and the exhibit that we can currently view. Just a couple of things that I think are quite relevant for today's lecture, especially in the inaugural talk about this exhibit, about Juan Antonio Sandoval Jr. One, I think it's important to know that he is was a reference librarian and collector, a reference librarian in art and Chicano studies at the University of Texas at El Paso for many, many years. And during that time, he became a legendary collector of Chicano, Mexicano, and borderlands art. And so I think we have him to thank, as well as Mexicarte, for this window into what borders conceal as well as what borderlands reveal here. And so today I'm going to start out by talking about the creation of the border. This is the first of the themed aspects of the exhibit. But I'm going to talk about it in a kind of, one, in a deep historical way, but also in a conceptual way. That is, I'm not just going to talk about the history of how the border was created say back in 1848, but I'm also going to say something about how the border is continuously created, made and unmade by nations, by people who live in the borderlands as well. So first off, I think it's important to note that we are talking about the US-Mexico border. That is the very specific borderlands we're talking about. But the concept of borders is much older than either Mexico or the United States, or even the concept of the nation state. That is, nations themselves are relatively recent historically. I mean, really only from the late 19th century or perhaps the mid 19th century. But borders, as the geopolitical expression of organized state power, those are much older. So we can think of the borders of empires, of kingdoms, of other forms of collective organization and governance that have historically existed. And they had borders of varying sorts, often different from the ones that we recognize now, but borders nonetheless. So the reality of borders is that people experience them through the exercise of state power in one form or another. And so I think for us, this is most recognizable when we have to go through customs or passport control, those sorts of things. Those are the moments in which we experience borders most viscerally and immediately. So those of us from the borderlands also know the checkpoints that are on the highways leading into the interior of Texas and other border states, right? About 70 miles out, I have to go through the Sarita checkpoint, often when I'm down in the Rio Grande Valley. So those are experiences of the border that, few in the who don't go outside of the interior of the U.S. really realize are there, but are everyday sort of reality for borderlands dwellers. Now, as I mentioned before, nations are fictions of antiquity, and I want to be clear that when I say fiction throughout this talk, I'm not saying that they're not real. I'm just saying that there is a certain kind of firmness of reality that we grant to them, and almost as a kind of force of nature. And as the great anthropologist and theorist of nation, Benedict Anderson, once said, everybody today in the modern world is born with a nationality in the same way that they are assigned a gender, right? We're assigned one at birth as if this were, a kind of edict of nature that we have a nationality. So but nations are historically recent, but they claim to be deep-rooted in the mythical past of various realms and rulers. So to be more specific, for the United States, really this is about claiming indigeneity, right? And so this is one of the great ironies of the United States, is that it has pursued this kind of question of being indigenous at the same time while pursuing essentially genocidal policies against indigenous peoples. So to give an example of this, in 1773, there's the Boston Tea Party, which helped ignite and consolidate the what we now call the American Revolution, where in fact the protesters, against British rule or British taxation without representation, dressed up in what they imagined to be as Indians or in red-faced, essentially. So that's not a coincidental articulation of kind of revolution and indigenous identity, because their claim was that no, we, the natives, need to be making decisions about governance, not some, foreigners across the sea. So, throughout the 19th century, this claim to be the rightful heirs to indigenous legacies, we see them in the place names that are still with us. So Manhattan, Iowa, Illinois, Mississippi, Alabama, Spokane. In fiction, you have Yoknapatawpha County, Faulkner's realm. And of course, Tejas, right? All of these are indigenous words that have been appropriated and incorporated into our sense of identity. And finally, the U.S. also claimed a kind of another kind of ancient historical narrative. Westward, the course of empire wends was a well-known phrase in the 19th century, in which the theory was that the great empires of the world proceeded, starting with ancient Greece, proceeded westward. So first Greece, then Rome, then the Spanish Empire, then the British Empire, and then, of course, in the 20th century, the American Empire, in this kind of teleology of greatness. Here in the US, it's better known as manifest destiny. So that is, in other words, the US may be recent, historically speaking, but it is part of a much older narrative, rooted in antiquity, of kind of a predestined greatness. Now, of course, Mexico has its own kind of mythologies around this as well. But there it's in the appropriation of the Mexica Empire, otherwise known as the Aztecs, right? So during the, one only need think of the Mexican flag, right, with the eagle and the serpent, which is not from, the period of national liberation in the early 19th century or afterwards, but, from Mexica mythology about the founding of Tenochtitlan. So, but similarly, during the struggle for national liberation, the Criollo elite cast anti-colonialism as a joint struggle of Criollos, the indigenous, and African natives, right, against the tyrannical and foreign peninsulares of Spain. So, and after the Mexican Revolution, mestizaje became the official state ideological basis of national unity, all the while continuing to displace or otherwise marginalize in actual indigenous communities. So these are fictions of national sovereignty, but they have power, they have force, they have a reality to them that that we experience every day. But one other aspect of this fiction is that we tend to think of national power as evenly, fully, and legitimately exercised within territorial boundaries, right? And I think the best example of this is that, you see a map of a nation and it's kind of colored and, very uniform and even, and, which is the kind of projection that, state power and sovereignty operates cohesively and uniformly across this territory. Of course it doesn't. It's much more complicated because national power is always contested and must be continuously established by activities and communities deemed outside national self-interest. That is, there are always groups that are contesting these boundaries and this idea of sovereignty. And of course, there's always the the state and national governments that are trying to continuously impose them or reestablish them. Now, of course, these contestations can occur anywhere within the national territory, right? It's not simply just at the border. But the borderlands are hypervisible locations of these occurrences. That is, the idea that, oh, all undocumented, crossing occurs at the US-Mexico border, when in fact it's the overstaying of visas for people who come in via air travel that make up the vast majority of these sorts of things. But the borderlands have always been viewed as a place of danger and suspicion of unevenness, both by the United States and by Mexico. It's a kind of weird part of the nation, but not quite at the same time. So here, though, I think the lesson is that sovereignty is both fictional, right, in the sense that it is not what it seems to be, but it's also performative. That is, agents of the state have to act in order to create a sovereignty. So national sovereignty is, in short, like Shakespeare's Claudius from Hamlet, a king of shred and patches. But borderlands art and artists really help reveal that, as it were, patchiness of this sovereignty and of the experiences of the borderlands. And I think that's what we see here in the exhibit, particularly in the creation, the idea of the creation of the border and the borderlands. Now I'll go ahead and share my screen with you to get to some specifics about the exhibit. And there we go. So I'll go ahead and there we go. So this is just really a kind of summary of what I've already kind of elaborated upon. So I'm not going to dwell upon it. But I'll just go ahead and say that the specific artworks that are in the collection and in the exhibit are, tremendously powerful and well worth seeing in person. So I encourage you, if you get a chance to visit the museum, to do so. Now, let me go ahead and start with some comments on the artworks themselves. I'm going to start with this idea of the indigenous presence and the idea of national sovereignty, particularly because, as I've already suggested, both the Mexican and the U.S. nation have been built or even predicated upon the erasure of an actual indigenous presence. Even as the symbols and of indigeneity have been appropriated. Now, the artist Marta Arat has an untitled, undated work that shows a Raramuri ceremony in which shaman, drummers, and other participants are conducting a ceremony. And I think the interesting thing about this particular work is, in fact, what appears to be its state of incompleteness, right? That there seems to be only a partially finished kind of image here. But I think I would rather suggest that it's not unfinished, but it's rather in process. That is, it is becoming, not being. And so, what to make of this situation? Well, I think the creation of art and life is really getting depicted as a collaborative communal process, right? That is the communal life. This is a communal event that is getting depicted, but I think the kind of creation of the filling out of the image is being co-created by not only the artist, but by the audience as well as we look at it. And it is something that really, it's almost an invitation for the audience to become co-creators in this process of seeing and meaning making. Just a quick point about the kind of what appears to be a sort of border, right? That is the border between the fully sketched out areas and colorized areas versus the seemingly blank or unfinished parts of this? Well, I really think this actually relates to the idea of the indigenous concept of the medicine line. And the medicine line was historically used to refer to the 49th parallel, that is the border between the US and Canada. And the members of the Blackfeet Confederacy talked about the medicine line because they noticed that the US troops who were pursuing them would stop as if by magic, right, at the 49th parallel, at the border, in other words. And so they were, their kind of conception is, why would they do that, right? The pursuit's a pursuit. And, but of course, the thing is, the US troops were under orders to respect Canada's national sovereignty, right? And so, but the point about the medicine line is precisely that borders are only for those who believe in them, right? Who believe in their power or their medicine, in other words. And those who do not, well, it means nothing or little. In I think the kind of, which is Jose Cisneros's sketch, The First Thanksgiving. Now, this, I think, this particular work is a reminder that state power is in fact exercised and borders are created, right, and enforced. That is, there is a process of border making and by state agents. And here we see, what's depicted is a Spanish colonial scene of the entrada of Juan de Onate into the El Paso region in 1598. And so we have the kind of institutions that were key to the Spanish colonization of the Americas represented, right, in the figure of the priest or the clergy, the Roman Catholic Church, the military or the soldier, the conquistadores, represented by Onate, and then the settlers or pobladores, right, who were key to securing Spanish sovereignty, the Spanish Empire's sovereignty in the area. So here we have the trifecta of Spanish imperialism kind of celebrating what they saw as the opening of new lands to them. But of course, there's this is in a long tradition by Mexican Americans during the 20th century to reclaim certain aspects of U.S. culture that they felt shut out of, right? And one of the arguments that they felt most keenly was that, well, people of Mexican descent in the U.S. did not contribute anything worthwhile, worth mentioning to U.S. history. Well, here, Cisneros is obviously countering the idea that the first Thanksgiving, that national tradition, was established either in Jamestown or in Plymouth Plantation, right? Because he's saying, no, the first Thanksgiving was in 1598 in El Paso, or the El Paso region. And that's what kind of, Spanish colonialism and their descendants kind of helped contribute, a full decade before, Jamestown or Plymouth Plantation. Now, but I think this is a rather, it's a difficult claim in the sense that on one hand, it is acknowledging that, yes, Spanish descent people in some way have been important to the making of the United States. On the other hand, the kind of indigenous presence is very occluded here. And in fact, of the dozen figures represented, only 2 are marked as indigenous, and they are very marginal to the kind of painting itself, right, and to the activities of the painting. In other words, it's a kind of decidedly one-sided affair about who is thankful for this entrada. And in fact, the indigenous people of the upper Rio Grande Valley in Nuevo Mexico would, come to see the following year in 1599. Well, this was not going to bode well for them because, of course, Onate carried out the Acoma Pueblo massacre, in which 800 men, women, and children were killed by Onate's forces, and many were enslaved. And among other things, 24 had their right foot cut off as a punishment. And of course, the controversies surrounding statues of Onate in El Paso and Nuevo Mexico today are direct result of the controversy around those actions and how we should remember them. So the next piece, well, really refers to more recent historical events, that is the creation of the US-Mexico border, and that tale of the US-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848 and its end in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is really well known, and I'm not going to rehearse it here other than to say that Mexico lost its northern half to the United States as a result. A little bit less known is actually the subject of the next slide, Ángel Bracho's Compraventa de Naciones, which is about the Gadsden, what is in the US known as the Gadsden Purchase, and in Mexico is the Tratado de Mesilla. So as you can see, the Gadsden Purchase is that the southern part of Arizona and New Mexico in 1853. And to get to the work, we see how, from the vantage point of a century later, Bracho, depicts this as the selling out of Mexico by its elites, right? With Santa Ana, greedy Santa Ana in the middle, but aided by the clergy, the Roman Catholic Church, and the business comprador elite of Mexico. And down in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the Mexican people bearing the burden or the brunt of all this, while the elite enrich themselves at the sale of more national territory, at the ceding of national sovereignty. And of course, the one who benefits is the robber baron Uncle Sam on the left, with Texas and La Mesilla in his pocket. So here, this is in the long tradition of Mexican artists protesting the depredations of the elite, or what they see as the depredations of the elite. But I think for our purposes in this exhibit, really the Treaty of Mesilla not only established what are now the contemporary southern borders of Arizona and New Mexico, but it also abrogated Title 11, of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this is significant because that article stipulated that the US would suppress cross-border raids into Mexico by the Apache and Comanche. Now, in other words, it may be a surprise to learn that the first Border Patrol was not about keeping Mexicans out of the United States, but rather of keeping indigenous tribal nations inside it, right? That's a kind of head turner. But 75% of the standing US Army in the early 1850s and millions of dollars could not do the job. In other words, the idea of national sovereignty was impossible to enforce in the face of determined indigenous resistance, showing it to be a performative fiction, right? It doesn't exist unless it's enforceable. And similarly, subsequent uprisings and rebellions by racially subjugated communities threatened US national sovereignty. And here I will only briefly mention the 1859 uprising by Juan Nepomuceno Cortina, the rebellion led by Caterino Garza in the early 1890s, and then the uprising by Los Sediciosos in 1915. Which I will very, very quickly touch upon in the next slide. I do caution that there is a kind of, it's a scene of some somewhat graphic racial violence. It's entirely composed, that is, it's posed, but nonetheless, it's disturbing. So here, I'm talking about La Matanza of 1915, which is part of the work that I am currently engaged with the Refusing to Forget project. We have a website, and so please visit it. But here, I will only briefly say that the events in the lower Rio Grande Valley, the uprising by Los Sediciosos, and its incredibly brutal suppression by local law enforcement, and especially the Texas Rangers, is part of the enforcing of the border, right? The creation of the border. And in here, it's explicitly racialized. So this is, as I mentioned, a completely composed photo, and you can see that there is an aesthetics of racial violence in the kind of composition, the very, very careful composition of this. This was very, very carefully thought out to demonstrate kind of what would happen to people, to Mexicans or Mexican descent people who got out of line in South Texas. With the promise of immunity from the governor, the Rangers just ran rampant until the federal troops had to be called in to not simply put down the rebellion, but to keep the Rangers in line. So this is all I will say about this incident, but nonetheless, it's important to put this in the context of how the borders are created, which include the establishment of economic and racial ones as well. To get back to the exhibit and really to start wrapping things up, because I really would love to see if we can engage in a dialogue afterwards, is Francisco Delgado's $26 from 1998. Because I think this and the next piece really show the contemporary contestation of borders and national sovereignty. That is, this isn't simply a struggle of the past, it's a present one. It's ongoing, it's every day, it's now. And so the creation of the border is happening as we speak. So in this particular piece, we have, what is in many ways a rather humorous kind of take on the portraits of US presidents from the dollar bill, bills that they represent. That is, of Andrew Jackson in the background, of Abraham Lincoln in the foreground, and then George Washington pulling up the rear. They're crossing into Ciudad Juarez from El Paso, right? That is, they're going north to south. And they, at the same time, are being accosted or solicited by various working class Mexicanos, right? Dressed up in Libre Lucha masks, who are trying to offer them various service, selling them chicles or, wiping down the window and that sort of thing. And so we see the various elements of the post-NAFTA economy, right? NAFTA goes in, the North American Free Trade Agreement goes into effect in 1994, also the year of the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas. But it, basically creates a kind of economic situation for the average Mexican worker, in which there are huge displacements, right, in traditional kind of work opportunities, and much of this gets displaced to the border, right? That is, we see the as it were, unintended consequences in increased undocumented migration. So at the same time, the depiction of these folks as luchadores is really they're fighting for survival, right? That they're just trying to make a living to survive from day to day, and they depend upon the almighty dollar to do that. Now, one of the ironies, of course, here is that neoliberal arrangements like NAFTA afforded greater mobility for capital, right, which is here represented by the U.S. dollars, than of people, than of labor. So, here we have the absurdity of seeing that abstractions, right, the abstractions of capital, as represented by these dollar bill presidents, have more mobility and, in fact, arguably more rights than actual people do. So this is something in which abstractions have more rights than people, and I think that's the commentary that is getting offered here. The next piece I'd like to dwell upon is a very contemporary piece, much closer to our own moment, of the Jellyfish Collective, called Leaning on the Border, Recargando sobre el borde. So, and this is a kind of very pop artish piece, which depicts someone kind of leaning against an unseen wall with one foot while a dog urinates on the other. And the humorous suggestion here is that how we often fail to notice how the border and the dog's actions are actually interrelated, right? They both depict our common obsession with marking territory. And so, taking a look at this, if you take a look at it, well, there's an implied, if invisible, wall that left foot leans against. But we can only kind of, as it were, process that or believe that if we believe that it's a three-dimensional surface, right? When in fact it's a two-dimensional serigraph. And so we, in other words, have to believe a certain kind of fiction, right? And in its reality. And the fiction of the edge or the borde. Now, what's interesting is that borde is not, that was a term, or the term borde as la frontera, right, as a border, was unfamiliar to me. And apparently this is a kind of like, in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, it's as common to refer to the border as el borde as it is la frontera, which is the usage I'm more familiar with. But nonetheless, of course, there's a double entendre, right? A double meaning to borde as edge. And so if we think of it as an edge, right, rather than a border, I think we see that that foot is resting on the edge, that is almost on the edge of the painting itself as well. And so there's a suggestion here that, in fact, we limit ourselves, we limit our imaginations when we think of a border as being hard and fast, right? When indeed it's much more interesting to think of it as a fiction that we believe in. And really renaming the border as el borde, or the edge, really kind of, I think, begins to displace some of the fixity that we may have about that term in our imaginations, right? So really, to start wrapping up, I think the border And the kind of sense that I come away with from this exhibit is that the border and therefore the borderlands, are under continuous creation. They're continuously created. Yes, there are certain key moments, but also that we experience them, their creation in the moment, in our here and now, today. They're never permanent, but continuously made and unmade, right? Made by nation states and their agents, and unmade by communities who may or may not find these useful, right? So borders are contested by migrants coming, fleeing economic hardship, political and cultural persecution, and increasingly climate change, as well as by a neoliberal capitalism, both legal and black market. And I think these artists have captured this dynamic and critically commented upon it in various ways, as we've talked about. And so really to wind up, I would like to thank Juan Antonio Sandoval Jr. For his foresight in collecting these and bequeathing them to Mexicarte Museum, and of course to the museum for giving us this wonderful exhibit, so where we can step out of our everyday lives for a moment to share this artistic vision about the borders. Thank you.
All right, now we'll be taking any questions. If anyone has any questions, please use the chat. You don't really have to raise your hand. And I'll direct those to either Dr. Vargas or Dr. Morán.
And certainly you can make comments as well as ask questions.
All right, we have a question about to answer live.
Very good.
Adrian Sanchez asking, how was the collection's artwork selected in order to tell this history? I'm guessing this one's for Dr. Morán.
Well, I would be happy to attempt an answer, even though I think Dr. Vargas might be able to add something. Really, this is about creating a story about the border, right? And not only from the U.S. side or artists who are working from the U.S. side, but the Mexican side as well. So the story is one of the borderlands is not, it's not one-sided. It's about both sides. It's about both sets of visions. And so, I mean, I think that might be one principle for the choice of works, but perhaps Dr. Vargas could elaborate.
Would you like to chime in on that, Dr. Vargas?
Yes, thank you, Dr. González, for that informative and entertaining lecture, by the way. It was great. Yes, when we received this awesome gift from Juan Sandoval, we really had not that much of an idea of its breadth and its depth. I personally knew Juan Sandoval, having worked at University of Texas, El Paso, and would visit his apartment, which was jammed from floor to ceiling, wall to wall, even the bathrooms, underneath the bed, and so forth, just jammed with books and art. So I knew some of the pieces already, but when we brought it from El Paso to Austin, then having received this National Endowment for the Humanities grant, we were really then looking forward to cataloging it. So as we cataloged it, we that is Sylvia Orozco, executive director, and then Andrew Anderson and Amber, we all got together and started putting these together in themes, knowing that we would have to organize the exhibit around these themes. So everything kind of fell forward. And we've barely scratched the surface. We have 1,500 pieces, both two-dimensional and three-dimensional, so that we still are looking to fully catalog and develop these themes. But what we have here is a dialogue among the artist with the viewer. And it's really the viewer that's important in interpreting this work of art, whatever it may be, whether it's a Jimenez, a Cisneros, a Marta Arat, to interpret this particular art in reference to their experience or experiences of the border, as is all art, of course, dependent upon the viewer.
All right, thank you. I have a few more. Let's see. Would you speak a little to how perspective, frontal with broad, undefined horizon line, contributes to a practice of the borderland and or to the contingency of place and time? From René Galvan. So I'll repeat it again. It's a little meaty. Would you speak a little to how perspective, frontal with broad, undefined horizon line, contributes to a practice of the borderland and or the contingency of place and time?
So, well, that's a great question. I will, just, take a attempt to answer it. I think the question of perspective is a really useful and interesting one, particularly, I think where it gets most highlighted, I hinted at it, is in the discussion of the last piece. But many of the other ones, in fact, do, as it were, comment upon it. I mean, first off, I think it's interesting to note that while there is a kind of range of style and techniques here, media as well, that nonetheless they are, I would broadly define them to be in a perspectival fashion, in a kind of more or less traditional a kind of three-dimensional perspective kind of approach. I'm saying, to some more than others, of course. And even though I think some of them have very interesting kind of foreshortening of perspective or playing around with the kind of concept, so I think there is a kind of more in-depth point to be made about how potentially the art of the borderlands would foreground the question of perspective in some way. While not, I mean, I think it's interesting that none of these are abstractions. It's not abstract art, right? So that there is some kind of tying to the question of perspective to the representation of that borderlands reality. It's not an abandoning of what we might call realism in art. Then there may be I think there's perhaps a necessity for that. But nonetheless, there are pieces that play with perspective more than others.
If I may piggyback on your comments, Dr. González, with Brunelleschi in the early Renaissance, inventing, so to speak, scientific perspective, that brought in the viewer. So this idea of bringing in the viewer into the work of art was achieved by perspective, by linear perspective, foreshortening, atmospheric perspective, as well as chiaroscuro. So these artists that we're looking at in this exhibit are mostly academically trained in the Western technique of perspective. However, they're also bringing in their own point of view. They are bringing in the viewer to share their experiences of the border through this idea of perspective. and chiaroscuro and other techniques that are used by these, as I said, formally or academically trained artists. They know what they're doing. Surely, these are tools that these artists have at their disposal by which to greater attract the viewer's attention and bring in the viewer into and underneath or beyond the surface of the painting.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have a few more from Vanessa de Verich Woodside. Says many thanks for this presentation and for sharing some of the pieces from the exhibit. From Patricia Garcia for Dr. González. In the images you shared, the focus was on the community and emphasis on images of people. How do you see images of nature, border, landscape as part of this depiction of the border and its struggles?
Yes, that's another great question, and I think in my view, at least, landscape or kind of nature paintings of the border are really meant to emphasize, or tend to emphasize, I should say, the kind of the fact that there are no borders, right? That is, that there are, it is a kind of continuous ecology. The Rio Grande, doesn't distinguish, the Tamaulipan thorn scrub north of the border from that south of the border, or the Sonoran Desert, kind of north of the border versus south of the border. So they have a tendency to kind of emphasize the erasure of borders. Now, on the other hand, there are some works that emphasize the different land use, right, on each side. And so you can have very starkly different local landscapes, right, from the US side or versus the Mexican side. And according to what the land use has been in that area. And so I would say for the most part, the landscape or kind of nature, those depicting nature rather than people, tend to emphasize that borders don't matter to nature, as it were. The kind of appropriation of the monarch butterfly as a kind of symbol of dreamers and other undocumented migrants is a kind of like, there are no borders here kind of sentiment. But they not always. They can emphasize kind of very local kind of differentiation between land use.
All right, we have another one asking, how long will the exhibit be available for viewing? I guess I will ask that one to Dr. Vargas.
Thank you, Jose. That's a great question. As mentioned in my introduction, the exhibit will be open until August 22nd. So, and the museum is open, by the way, 7 days a week. And we also offer free admission on Sunday. Every month, every Sunday, we have free admission. So everyone is welcome to the museum to view what I think is a very powerful, very moving exhibition. We also have developed some online programs that the viewers can follow if they go to our webpage, our Facebook, Instagram, and so forth, by which to immerse themselves in this particular exhibition. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Vargas. Javier Morin says, gracias, great presentation. Miriam Rivero says, Thank you so much for the presentation. Do you foresee the fiction of borders being further cemented in the future? Are there any specific technological advances you imagine would help subvert them?
Wonderful question, and I think it's a continuous, as I said in my presentation, the making and unmaking of the border is a kind of continuous struggle. All right, it's a power struggle, right, between nation states who feel that they have to somehow reinforce and construct walls, virtual or actual, versus people, who feel that these are unneeded, they're unnecessary, they are, an imposition to their right to migrate for a better life. Now, I think, so in other words, technology is I think it's often mostly associated with kind of exploitation or kind of the creation of uh, more surveillance, right, of the border, and basically because of the resources that it consumes and who can afford that, right, better than others. Some of the governments can afford those better than others. On the other hand, I think I'll point to Alex Rivera's film The Sleep Dealer as kind of one potential direction of how technological advances can be both used to, as it were, further the intensification of difference, as well as to subvert them at times.
Thank you.
It's a great response. I also wanted enough time to follow up and direct some questions to you, but we've run out of time, especially predestination, manifest destiny, which you mentioned, and Frederick Turner's theses on the frontier. And I think the Frederick Turner's idea of the frontier is still very relevant, especially when we look at the last 4 years of the previous president and how he exploited this idea of changing the borders up, of blocking the borders to immigrants and migrants who historically have crossed over. On that note, we will now close the program. Again, we want to thank Dr. González for a marvelous presentation. We also want to thank Mario and Jose for facilitating this. And we want to invite you to hear our second scholar, Dr. Laura G. Gutierrez, presenting Land, Fauna, and Allegories, Performance, Art, and Video in the Chihuahua Desert on March 27th. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again. Thank you, you all.
Thank you.